Little Laura didn't know that she was about to change her family's destiny forever. Living in a slum on the outskirts of Atlanta, she woke up every day with the first rays of sunlight, not even remembering whether it was day or night. For her, time was a vague concept, always defined by meals and the chores her mother gave her. At 5 years old, Laura already knew what it meant to fight to survive. It was unbearably hot that day. One of those summer mornings when the air seemed stuck to the skin. The sound of cars passing by in the distance, mixed with the cries of street vendors and the shouts of children playing in the street, was part of Laura's routine. She always woke up quietly, as usual. The house she shared with her mother and 3 siblings was a small wooden structure, where the walls seemed to crack more with each passing day. There, the silence of the early morning transformed into an incessant noise, always present, always uncomfortable. But on that day, the noise was interrupted. In the distance, at the end of the street, a large, shiny, and imposing car suddenly stopped. The engine roared for a moment, and then a door opened, causing the dust in the air to rise like a cloud. It was the kind of car people in the slum rarely saw. And when they did, they considered it a symbol of power, something unattainable. Laura looked on curiously, trying to understand what was happening, while her mother, Dona Rosa, yelled for her to stay inside the house. She always warned her about the dangers of going outside when strangers appeared in the neighborhood. And that car seemed out of place. The man who got out of the vehicle was tall and imposing, dressed in expensive clothes and wearing sunglasses. He didn't look at anyone, not even the children running through the street, but his presence caused a certain discomfort. He seemed uninterested in everything around him. His only goal seemed to be to reach a nearby house, a large weathered wooden home, where he knocked on the door forcefully. That house belonged to one of the richest and most influential men in the city, Colonel Harold Smith, but it wasn't that which caught Laura's attention. It wasn't the man in sunglasses, nor the enormous car, nor the serious face of the colonel. What made her move closer was the sharp cry of a child. Laura, with her incessant curiosity, looked out the window and saw a boy about her age running down the sidewalk. But he wasn't paying attention to what was happening around him. He was crossing the street in a hurry, as if running from something, but not noticing the danger. The sound of a car approaching was muffled by the noise of Laura's own thoughts, until she finally realized the car was almost upon the boy. Without thinking twice, Laura ran down the street toward the boy. She shouted for him to stop, but he didn't hear. The sound of the engine grew louder by the second, and the car seemed to be heading straight toward the boy at an alarming speed. Laura felt her heart pound in her chest as she ran with all her might. She lunged forward, reaching the boy just in time. With a swift movement, she pulled him to the side, making him fall with her onto the ground. The car passed so close that Laura could feel the rush of air from the tires and heard the screech of the brakes, but they were safe. The boy was unharmed, breathing heavily, unable to understand what had just happened. Laura, still on the ground, looked at him and saw the boy's wide, frightened eyes. He was in shock, not knowing what to do. And then a tear ran down his face, not because he was hurt, but because fear, surprise, and gratitude took over him. Laura, with her calm gaze, helped the boy to his feet. "It's okay. You're not hurt," she said, even though she didn't quite know how he was feeling. But she knew what it was like to feel fear and have someone around to help you. And that's what she did. The boy, still trembling, looked at her with tear-filled eyes, unable to speak. "Thank you," he whispered, still at a loss for words to explain what had just happened. But Laura felt that words weren't necessary. At that moment, the man from the large car appeared. He was visibly angry, but when he saw that the boy was safe, his expression quickly changed. He rushed toward them, and, in a harsh tone, asked, "What did you do to him?" Laura, without hesitation, pointed to the boy and answered honestly, "I just helped him." The man looked at her, first with distrust, but something in Laura's eyes made him pause for a moment, thinking. The boy was still trembling, but the man's concern seemed to fade slowly, as if he was beginning to understand what had really happened. "You saved my son," the man said, his voice softer now. He looked at the boy, who was now catching his breath, and then turned his gaze back to Laura, as if he were evaluating her. There was something curious, and at the same time, something grateful, in his look. Laura didn't know who he was, nor who the boy was. She only knew she had done something good. And for some reason, it seemed important. The man didn't say anything more, but looked toward the colonel, who was now standing at his door, watching the scene with an attentive, almost impassive look. The colonel, seemingly calmer, approached and looked at the situation. "Who are you, girl?" he asked, his voice deep and serious. His usual impassive gaze was now softer, as if there was something different in the way he saw her. "I'm Laura," she replied, with her usual sincerity. "I just helped him." The colonel watched her for a long moment, as if he were weighing his words. The scene dragged on for a moment, until he finally spoke. "You did something no one else would have done, Laura. I won't forget this." And with those words, the colonel entered the house, carrying his son in his arms, leaving Laura there, alone, with the feeling that her life was about to change forever. The days following that encounter with Colonel Harold Smith and his son were confusing for Laura. She didn't understand why something so simple, like saving a child's life, caused so much commotion. In her childlike mind, she had just done what anyone would do if they saw someone in danger. But when she looked around at the adults, she could tell that something had changed. Her mother, Dona Rosa, seemed quieter than usual, and the looks from people in the neighborhood followed her with an uncomfortable curiosity. At first, Laura hadn't noticed, but soon enough, she realized that the neighborhood, which was usually indifferent, now looked at her with a kind of reverence, as if she was someone different. That morning, after another night of interrupted sleep due to the noise of the street, Laura woke up earlier than usual. Her siblings were still asleep, and her mother was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, with that smell of burnt coffee that always indicated the day would start off busy. She heard her mother murmuring, probably worrying about the bills piling up or another argument breaking out on the street corner. Laura quickly got dressed and went to the front door, where she stood observing the street. The houses around her were simple, with peeling roofs and fences falling apart little by little. Even so, there was something familiar and comforting in the things she saw, something that made her feel safe, despite the hardships. It was then that Colonel Smith's car appeared again, cutting through the street with its imposing presence. The vehicle stopped in front of Laura's house, and this time, the man who had gotten out of the car last time was not alone. He was accompanied by another man, older, with a serious expression and a watchful eye. Laura didn't know who the man was, but she felt that he had the same kind of authority as the colonel. The colonel got out of the car, but this time, he didn't seem in such a hurry. He looked at Laura's house for a moment, as if deciding something, then walked up to the front door. "Dona Rosa," he called out, his voice strong but respectful. Dona Rosa appeared quickly, with a cloth in her hand, trying to tidy up as she always did when unexpected visitors arrived. Laura watched from inside the house, curious and a bit anxious. The colonel looked at Laura's mother with a serious expression. "I'm Colonel Harold Smith," he said directly. "I'd like to speak with you." Dona Rosa stayed silent for a moment, probably trying to understand why such an important man was at her door. She looked at him, a bit wary, before nodding and inviting him in. "Please, come in," she said with a somewhat nervous smile. The colonel and the older man entered, and Laura stayed by the door, watching them with curious eyes. It wasn't common for people like Colonel Smith to enter their home, and she felt like something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. Dona Rosa led them into the living room, where the colonel sat with a determined air. The older man stood beside him, arms crossed. The tension in the room was so palpable that Laura could almost touch it. She felt the weight of their visit, as if the adults were in an important conversation. The colonel looked at Dona Rosa with seriousness and began speaking in an unusually calm tone. "I'm here, Dona Rosa, because my family and I would like to express our gratitude. Your daughter saved my son's life. This is not something one forgets easily." Dona Rosa looked at Laura, surprised. She didn't exactly know what was happening, but something in the colonel's expression suggested that something big was going on. "Laura did what anyone would have done, Colonel," Dona Rosa said firmly, trying to avoid embarrassing her daughter. "She just helped that boy." The colonel smiled gently, but his expression soon grew more serious. "I understand, Dona Rosa, but what Laura did was far more than most would do. She acted with courage and empathy, and we believe that deserves to be recognized in a special way." The tension grew even thicker. Laura, who had been standing by the door, felt her stomach tighten. She didn't know what was happening, but the word special sounded strange and a bit frightening to her. The colonel continued, "I want to offer a reward to Laura for her gesture, a way to show our gratitude, something that, in a way, could change your family's life." Dona Rosa fell silent, clearly perplexed by what was being said. She looked at Laura, who was still watching everything with a mix of confusion and curiosity. The older man next to the colonel gave a slight nod, as if approving what was being said. "I've thought of something more concrete, Dona Rosa," the colonel added, his tone softer now. "We'll help your family with the financial struggles. We'll offer you a stable job, something that can relieve your worries. And for Laura, we'll think of something that matches the value of her gesture." Dona Rosa stayed silent, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. She looked at Laura, who was now standing in front of her, and their eyes met. Laura felt a mix of fear and hope. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew that something important was happening. "I don't know," Dona Rosa started hesitantly. "I don't want my daughter to get involved in something. I don't know. Dangerous. It's not about that, Dona Rosa," the colonel said calmly. "It's about fair recognition, and we're not here to harm anyone. We're just trying to give back in a way that makes sense." Laura looked at her mother, waiting for some sort of reaction. She still didn't understand what was happening, but a part of her felt that this was important, and in some way, the idea of having a better future seemed more possible than ever. "I accept," Dona Rosa finally said, her voice tense. She looked at Laura, who was now standing before her, and their eyes met again. Laura felt a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew that something significant was happening. The colonel stood up, extending his hand to Dona Rosa. "We'll work together to improve your family's life. That's my commitment." And with those words, Laura and her family's life would begin to change forever. The days that followed were filled with a strange quietness, one that Laura had never really felt before. Things weren't the same. The constant hum of the neighborhood, the sounds of the market just down the street, the chatter of the children in the park, everything seemed to be a little quieter, a little more distant. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing could be more dramatic or unsettling than what Laura and her mother would soon face. The morning after the colonel's visit, when Dona Rosa had reluctantly agreed to accept his offer, Laura noticed a car parked outside their house. It was sleek and black, very different from the usual worn-out cars that came down their street. She hadn't seen it before. It looked out of place, and she couldn't help but stare at it. "Who's that?" she asked her mother as she walked past the window. Dona Rosa was standing in the kitchen, quietly stirring a pot of oatmeal. She didn't seem as bothered by the car as Laura was. It was as if she had already gotten used to the idea that something was changing in their lives. She just nodded, not looking up. "It's someone from the colonel's office," Dona Rosa said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "They'll be here to talk about the job." Laura didn't fully understand. She didn't know why anyone would want to give her mother a job, especially someone as important as Colonel Smith. All she knew was that things were moving quickly. Her mother had been getting dressed in a way she never did before, more carefully, like she was preparing for something. It was as if the visit from the colonel had already put them on a different path, one they couldn't turn back from. The doorbell rang just as Laura finished eating her breakfast. She was still sitting at the table when Dona Rosa opened the door to greet the visitor. It was a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. He had a stern face, his eyes sharp and calculating, like someone who was always in control. "Good morning," the man said, offering his hand to Dona Rosa. "I'm Mr. Turner. I'm here to discuss the opportunity Colonel Smith mentioned." Dona Rosa took his hand, and Laura watched closely from her seat. She had never seen her mother behave so formally before, and it made her nervous. Her mother was usually warm and easygoing, but today she seemed distant, almost like a stranger. Mr. Turner stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He glanced around the small living room, his eyes taking in the modest furniture and the faded curtains. Laura could see the way he looked at their home, not with judgment, but with the kind of detached observation one might use when assessing a business transaction. It made her feel small, like she wasn't supposed to be in the room. "Thank you for seeing me today, Dona Rosa," Mr. Turner said as he sat down in the chair across from her. He opened his briefcase, pulling out a folder that looked official. "I'm here to talk to you about the job offer the colonel discussed. But first, I need to understand a little more about your situation. The colonel wants to ensure that this opportunity will truly benefit your family." Laura could barely breathe. She wasn't sure if it was because of the way Mr. Turner looked at them or because of the sudden, overwhelming sense that their lives were about to be scrutinized, examined in ways they had never been before. But one thing was clear. This man wasn't here to offer charity. He was here to make a deal. And Dona Rosa, despite her initial hesitation, was going to listen. "We don't have much, as you can see," Dona Rosa said, her voice low. She didn't seem ashamed, just honest. "But we make do. I work hard, and I've raised my children to do the same, Mr. Turner nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "Hard work is exactly what we need, Dona Rosa. The Colonel believes in rewarding that kind of effort, and he's prepared to offer you a position at his company. It's a steady job with a reliable income. It could be life-changing for you." At the mention of the job, Laura's mind raced. She didn't understand all the words Mr. Turner was using, but she could see the shift in her mother's expression. A job with a reliable income. It sounded so important, so secure. Dona Rosa's eyes sparkled slightly, as if a door to a new world had just opened before her. "I don't know what to say," Dona Rosa whispered, more to herself than to Mr. Turner. "I've never had a job like that. Never worked for anyone so important. It's a big change," Mr. Turner said calmly. "But we believe you'll do well. The Colonel trusts you. He wants to see your family thrive. He's made this decision because of your daughter." Laura's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected that. The Colonel had mentioned her, but to hear it again spoken so directly felt strange. She wasn't sure whether to feel proud or scared. All she had done was pull a child out of the street. Why was this such a big deal? Mr. Turner continued, oblivious to Laura's thoughts. "You'll be expected to work hard. The job is demanding, but the pay will reflect that. You'll be helping the Colonel's family, and you'll have the stability you've been looking for." "I'll take it," Dona Rosa said finally, after a long pause. "I'll take the job." Laura's world seemed to tilt. A job with the Colonel's family. She had no idea what that even meant, but she could sense the weight of her mother's decision. She could feel how much it mattered, how everything had just shifted. "Excellent," Mr. Turner said with a slight smile, as if he'd expected nothing less. "We'll get started right away," as he stood up to leave. Laura felt a rush of emotions, fear, uncertainty, but also something new, something she hadn't felt before. Hope. As Mr. Turner made his way to the door, he turned to Dona Rosa and offered one final piece of advice. "Make sure you understand the importance of this. The Colonel is offering you an opportunity that most people would never even dream of. But it comes with responsibilities. Responsibilities to the Colonel and to his family." Dona Rosa nodded, a serious expression on her face. "We understand," she said quietly. And with that, Mr. Turner left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that something much bigger than a job offer had just taken root in their lives. A decision had been made, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Mr. Turner's visit were filled with a flurry of new activities. Dona Rosa seemed to move differently now. There was a new energy in her steps, a kind of determination that Laura hadn't seen before. She woke up earlier, worked harder, and spoke with a newfound confidence that came from knowing there was a path ahead. But for Laura, the change was unsettling. She hadn't asked for any of this, and the more she thought about the whole situation, the more she realized that the life they had once known was slipping away, bit by bit. The mornings were colder now, and the sun took longer to rise over the row of houses in the neighborhood. Laura's siblings still didn't fully understand what had happened or what was going to happen. They played outside, carefree as usual, while their mother's attention was focused on preparing for this new job. And then, one afternoon, just a few days after the meeting with Mr. Turner, the phone rang. Laura had never seen her mother jump at the sound of the phone before, but this time, Dona Rosa rushed to the receiver almost as if she'd been expecting the call. Laura stood by the doorframe, watching as her mother's face shifted between excitement and a kind of nervous anticipation. "Hello," Dona Rosa said into the receiver, her voice almost trembling. "Yes, this is she." Laura couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she could see the way her mother's eyes widened. Dona Rosa nodded a few times, as if confirming something, and then a small smile crossed her face. "Thank you," Dona Rosa said, before quickly handing up the phone. "Who was that, Mama?" Laura asked, her curiosity getting the best of her. Her mother turned around, her face glowing with something that almost looked like disbelief. "It's the Colonel's people," Dona Rosa explained, her voice full of wonder. "They want me to start next week. They've arranged everything for me. The job, the schedule, everything. I can't believe it, Laura. This is happening." Laura felt a mix of emotions. She could see the happiness in her mother's face, and it made her heart swell with pride. But there was also a part of her that felt a little lost. This wasn't the life she had imagined. She had no idea what her mother's new job would involve. and although it promised stability, there was a lingering sense of uncertainty that she couldn't shake. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Laura asked. Dona Rosa paused for a moment, the smile slowly fading from her face. She looked at her daughter, and for a brief second, Laura could see the doubt in her eyes, something that had always been there, hidden behind the smiles and the determination. "Of course I am, sweetie," Dona Rosa admitted softly. "I don't know what I'm getting into, but I'm doing this for you. For all of you. I want a better life for us." Laura nodded, unsure of what to say. She wanted to be supportive, but a part of her still didn't understand why things were changing so fast. Why this man? Colonel Smith was so eager to help them. There had to be something else at play. She had heard rumors in the neighborhood about people like him, wealthy, powerful, influential people who didn't do anything unless there was something in it for them. Laura couldn't ignore the possibility that they were being pulled into a situation far bigger than they understood. As the days went by, the changes continued. Dona Rosa started her new job at the Colonel's estate, and Laura noticed her mother's new routine. She would leave early in the morning, before the sun was fully up, and return late in the evening, tired but with a sense of purpose. Laura's siblings, especially the younger ones, seemed to miss her, but they adapted quickly, just as children always do. At night, Dona Rosa would sit at the table and tell them about her day. She was careful not to say too much, always giving just enough detail to keep them interested without revealing anything that might make them worry. "The Colonel's house is beautiful," she would say. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before. And the work isn't too hard, thank goodness. It's mostly cleaning, keeping things in order. But there are other people there too, helping out. And the Colonel, he's kind, Laura. He's not like what people say about rich men. He's been very generous." Laura listened, trying to imagine what it must be like to work in such a grand place, surrounded by wealth and luxury. It seemed so far removed from their reality. But she also noticed something else in her mother's eyes, a growing unease, a quiet doubt that she was trying to hide. Perhaps even from herself. One evening, as Dona Rosa was getting ready for bed, Laura couldn't help but ask the question that had been on her mind for days. "Mama," Laura began, her voice small and uncertain, "why is Colonel Smith helping us?" Dona Rosa turned to face her daughter, her expression softening. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands folding in her lap. She took a deep breath, as though gathering her thoughts before answering. "I don't know, Laura," she admitted quietly. "But sometimes people do things because they believe it's right. Sometimes they see something in us, something they want to help. And maybe, just maybe, he's doing this because he believes in kindness." Laura wasn't so sure. She had heard too many stories in the neighborhood about people who helped for their own reasons, who used kindness to get something in return. But she didn't say anything more. Her mother was tired, and the conversation ended there, left hanging in the air between them. The next morning, when Laura woke up, she noticed something new. A small envelope was resting on the kitchen table. It was addressed to her mother in neat handwriting. Dona Rosa hadn't said anything about receiving mail, and this was the first time Laura had seen an envelope like this. It looked important, and something about it made her heart race. "Mama," Laura called, her voice trembling slightly, "there's a letter for you." Dona Rosa stepped into the kitchen, her face brightened by a tired but happy smile. She took the envelope from Laura's hands, glancing at it before tearing it open. Inside, there was a simple note written in a careful, formal script. Laura couldn't read all the words, but she could make out the important parts. It was an invitation to meet the Colonel's family. A private dinner. The words echoed in Laura's mind, and she felt her pulse quicken. Why was her mother being invited to such an event? And what was really behind all of this? But Dona Rosa just smiled again, this time more confidently, as if everything was falling into place. "This is it, Laura," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "This is my chance." And so, in the days that followed, Dona Rosa prepared for the dinner with the Colonel's family. Little did she know that this night would change everything. The night of the dinner arrived much sooner than Laura had anticipated. Everything about it felt surreal to her. It wasn't that she didn't want her mother to succeed. Of course, she did. But something about the whole situation made her uneasy. The Colonel's generosity, his sudden interest in their family, it all seemed too good to be true. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a world they didn't fully understand, a world where things weren't as simple as they seemed. Dona Rosa was nervous, though she did her best to hide it. She had never been to a dinner like this before, never been invited into the home of someone so powerful. She had grown up in poverty, and while she had worked for others in various jobs over the years, none had offered anything close to what the Colonel was offering. This felt like a breakthrough, an opportunity to step out of the life she had known and into something better. It was hard not to be excited. As the hour approached, Dona Rosa put on her best dress, the one she had saved for special occasions. It was simple but elegant, and she couldn't help but admire herself in the mirror. For the first time in years, she felt like she was someone important, someone who deserved to be at the table with people like Colonel Smith. Laura, standing in the doorway of the bedroom, watched her mother's preparations. There was a mix of pride and worry on her face. Her mother's transformation was undeniable. But she couldn't forget the doubts she had in her mind. This wasn't just any dinner, it was a private affair with the Colonel's family, and Laura had a bad feeling about it. "Mama," she said quietly, her voice breaking through the silence, "do you really think everything will be okay?" Dona Rosa paused. Adjusting the strap of her dress, she turned around to face Laura, her eyes soft with affection, but also with a hint of something unspoken. She placed a hand on Laura's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I hope so, my love. I really do. This is our chance. Just remember, we've always done our best. And that's all we can do." Laura didn't answer. She wanted to believe her mother, to have faith that everything was going to work out. But deep down, she still felt the gnawing sense that they were stepping into a game they didn't fully understand. As Dona Rosa left to catch the car that would take her to the Colonel's estate, Laura stayed behind, sitting quietly at the table, her mind racing. She kept thinking about the note, the invitation to the dinner. Why did the Colonel want her mother there? What did he really want from them? It wasn't just kindness. She was certain of it. There had to be a reason behind all of this. The evening passed slowly. Laura did her best to keep herself busy, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her mother. She imagined Dona Rosa at the Colonel's house, surrounded by strangers who were likely more powerful and wealthy than anyone Laura had ever met. She could picture her mother sitting at the table, trying to fit in, trying to keep up with a world that was so far beyond their reach. Around PM, the phone rang. Laura's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated for a moment before answering, not sure what to expect. It was rare that anyone called at this hour. "Hello," she said, her voice quiet. "Laura, sweetheart, it's Mama," came the familiar voice on the other end. Relief flooded through Laura's body. It was her mother, but there was something strange about her voice. It wasn't the excitement she had expected. Instead, there was a calmness to it, a quietness that unsettled Laura even more. "Mama, are you okay?" Laura asked, her words tumbling out quickly. "Is everything all right?" Yes, everything's fine," Dona Rosa said, but there was an edge to her voice that Laura couldn't quite place. "I just wanted to let you know that I'll be home a little later than planned. There's something else I need to do here." Laura's stomach tightened. She didn't like the sound of that. She had been expecting her mother to return soon, to hear all about the dinner, but this felt different. The way Dona Rosa spoke, it was as if something had shifted, something that Laura couldn't see, but felt in the air. "Mama, what's going on?" "What do you mean, something else?" Dona Rosa was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost like she was trying to keep something from Laura. "I can't explain it now, sweetheart. Just trust me, okay? This is all part of the plan. Everything will be fine." Before Laura could ask any more questions, her mother hung up the phone. The sudden click of the line going dead felt final. Laura sat there, holding the receiver in her hand, staring at the wall in confusion. What plan? What was her mother talking about? She didn't know what to do next. Her mind was racing, filled with too many questions and not enough answers. She paced around the small house, trying to make sense of everything. She wanted to call her mother back, to insist on knowing what was going on, but something inside her told her to wait. There was something else happening, something bigger than she could understand at that moment. A few hours passed before the car finally pulled up outside the house. Laura hurried to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. When she opened it, she saw her mother standing there, her expression unreadable. "Mama," Laura exclaimed, rushing forward. "What happened? Why didn't you call back? Are you okay?" Dona Rosa stepped inside without saying a word. She looked tired, more so than usual, but her face was calm, almost too calm. Laura could see that her mother was holding something in her hands, a small envelope. It was the same kind of envelope that had come for her mother before. "What is that?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dona Rosa didn't answer immediately. She just walked over to the table and set the envelope down. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, as if weighing the decision in her mind. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. "It's the next step," she said quietly. "This is what we've been waiting for. Everything is about to change." Laura felt a chill run down her spine. The uncertainty that had been growing in her heart over the past few days was now overwhelming. What had really happened at that dinner? And why did it feel like her mother was hiding something from her? The envelope on the table felt like an anchor, heavy with the promise of something unknown. Laura couldn't help but stare at it, her mind racing as her mother quietly took a seat across from her. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with tension. Dona Rosa hadn't said much after her brief explanation, and Laura couldn't help but wonder why. "What is this, Mama?" Laura asked again, her voice trembling. She had to know. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that everything was just happening for no reason. Dona Rosa reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing it gently before she slid it toward Laura. The hesitation in her mother's movements didn't go unnoticed. It was as if she was holding something back, something she didn't want to share. This is an invitation," Dona Rosa finally said, her voice soft but firm. "An invitation to something bigger, something I wasn't expecting." Laura picked up the envelope, carefully peeling open the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper, embossed with a crest that looked far too grand for someone like her family. The letter inside was short, but the words seemed to weigh a ton. It was from Colonel Smith's family. "Dear Mrs. Rosa Martinez, we are pleased to inform you that after your impressive performance at the dinner, we would like to extend an offer to you for a permanent position in our household. Your skills and qualities have made a strong impression on our family, and we believe you will be a valuable addition to our team. Please meet us tomorrow at our estate to discuss the details. We are eager to move forward with this opportunity. Sincerely, the Smith family." Laura stared at the letter in disbelief. A permanent position in their household? Was her mother really being offered a job with them? She had no idea what kind of position it could be, but the words "impressive performance" stood out to her. This wasn't just any offer, it was something important, something bigger than anything they had ever imagined. For a moment, Laura felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to celebrate. Her mother was being given a chance, an opportunity that could change their lives. But another part of her gut, her instinct, was telling her to be careful, that this wasn't as simple as it seemed. "Are you going to take it?" Laura asked it, her voice quiet, almost fearful. Dona Rosa's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a while, Laura saw a flicker of uncertainty in her mother's gaze. "I don't know, Laura. This is a big decision, but it could change everything. For all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with the weight of their significance. Laura didn't know what to say. She wanted her mother to be happy, to find success, but she also couldn't ignore the doubts gnawing at her. Was this all too good to be true? What was really behind the Colonel's offer? That night, Dona Rosa didn't sleep much. She spent hours pacing around the house, her mind turning over the possibilities. The offer seemed like a dream, one that had come out of nowhere and seemed too perfect to ignore. But still, there was a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that she couldn't quite shake. She kept wondering if she was being too quick to accept something that could change their lives in ways they couldn't predict. The next morning, Dona Rosa dressed carefully for the meeting. She wore a simple yet elegant blouse and skirt, trying to look her best without drawing too much attention to herself. She knew that she had to be careful. This was a new world for her, a world where everything felt different. She had no idea what she was walking into. But she also knew that it could be the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever dreamed. Laura watched her mother as she prepared to leave, her heart heavy with worry. She wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but she held back. She knew that her mother was determined, and she didn't want to add to her burden. Before Dona Rosa left, she turned to Laura, her face soft with a mixture of love and concern. "I know you're scared, sweetie, but sometimes we have to take chances. We can't always stay in the same place forever." Laura nodded silently. She understood, but the fear still lingered. She wanted to believe that everything was going to be okay. But there was a part of her that wasn't sure. As Dona Rosa left for the Colonel's estate, Laura was left in the quiet house, alone with her thoughts. The hours stretched on, the clock ticking slowly, each minute feeling longer than the last. She kept replaying the events of the past few days in her mind, the Colonel's visit, the dinner, the offer. It all felt like a whirlwind, moving faster than she could comprehend. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dona Rosa returned. She entered the house quietly, her footsteps heavy with the weight of the decision she had just made. Laura rushed to meet her at the door, her heart racing with anticipation. "Well?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened? What did they say?" Dona Rosa didn't answer right away. She simply walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, her face pale and tired. Laura stood by the door, waiting for her mother to speak. "They offered me the job," Dona Rosa said slowly, her voice flat. "They want me to start immediately." Laura's heart skipped a beat. "So, what did you say?" "I said yes," Dona Rosa replied, her voice still distant, as if she wasn't entirely sure of what she had just agreed to. "I couldn't say no, this is what we've been waiting for." But even as she spoke the words, Laura could tell that something didn't feel right. Her mother had agreed to something, but there was a hesitation in her tone, a sense that she wasn't entirely sure of the path she had just chosen. Days passed after Dona Rosa accepted the Colonel's offer, and the weight of the decision hung over their small house like a shadow. Laura couldn't escape the feeling that things were moving too quickly. Her mother, despite her outward appearance of confidence, seemed different. There was a distance in her eyes now, a hesitation in her step. It wasn't that Laura didn't want to be happy for her mother, she did. But something felt wrong, and Laura couldn't put her finger on it. The first few days at the Colonel's estate were quiet, almost too quiet. Dona Rosa didn't come home as often as she had before, and when she did, she was always tired, always carrying the weight of something unsaid. Laura noticed that her mother rarely spoke about what went on at the estate, and whenever she did, her answers were vague. "How was your day, Mama?" Laura would ask, her voice filled with curiosity. "It was fine, sweetheart. Just a busy day. Lots of work to do," Dona Rosa would respond, her voice distant, as if she was somewhere else. "But it's good work. The Colonel's family is very pleased with me, at first." Laura tried to accept these answers, but soon the unease in her heart grew. She missed the days when they could talk openly, when her mother wasn't carrying the heavy silence of the estate with her. Laura began to feel like she was losing her mother to this new life, to a world she couldn't reach or understand. But then, one evening, Dona Rosa came home earlier than usual. It was just after sunset, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, when the sound of the front door opening caught Laura's attention. She looked up from the small kitchen table, where she had been sitting, studying a schoolbook. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face drawn and tired, but there was something different about her this time, a sense of urgency in her eyes, something that made Laura's heart race. "Laura, come here," Dona Rosa said, her voice low, as if someone might be listening. Laura's pulse quickened as she hurried to her mother. "What happened?" "Mama?" "You're home early." Dona Rosa didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the door behind her quietly, glancing over her shoulder, almost as if making sure they were alone. Then she turned to face Laura, her expression serious. "I need to tell you something, Laura," Dona Rosa began, her voice trembling slightly. "Something happened today, something I didn't expect." Laura's heart began to pound. She could see that her mother was clearly shaken by whatever had happened. This was no ordinary day at the estate. Whatever had transpired, it was enough to bring her mother to the brink. "What happened?" Laura asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though her mind was racing. Dona Rosa sat down heavily on the couch, her hands shaking as she folded them together in her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "The Colonel, he's been acting strange lately. The way he looks at me, the way he talks to me, it's not the same. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but today he crossed a line." Laura sat down beside her mother, her worry growing with each word. "What do you mean, Mama? What did he do?" Dona Rosa's eyes flickered with something Laura couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or something darker. "He made advances, Laura. He tried to make me stay, in a way I didn't want. He wanted more than just my work. And when I refused, he got angry. He told me I'd regret it if I left." Laura's breath caught in her throat. "Mama, what did you do? Did you leave?" Dona Rosa shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut deep. "I couldn't just leave, Laura. I'm not sure what he's capable of, but I couldn't afford to leave. Not yet." Laura's mind raced. What kind of man was Colonel Smith? What kind of world had her mother stepped into? She had never imagined anything like this. Her mother had been offered a job to help their family, and now it seemed like that offer came with strings attached. Strings that could unravel everything. "I'll go to the police," Laura said firmly, her voice shaking with determination. "We'll tell them everything. We don't have to take this." "No," Dona Rosa said quickly, grabbing Laura's hand. "You can't. Not yet. If we go to the police now, everything will fall apart. I don't know what the Colonel would do, but I'm afraid it will hurt us more than it helps." Laura stared at her mother in disbelief. "What do you mean, Mama? What do we do then?" "Just stay silent." "I don't know," Dona Rosa whispered, "but I have to find another way. I need time. I need to figure out what to do next." Laura felt helpless. She couldn't understand why her mother was so afraid to act. She had always taught Laura to stand up for herself, to never let anyone take advantage of her. And yet, here they were trapped in a situation where fear seemed to be the only thing holding them together. The days that followed were marked by a heavy silence. Dona Rosa went back to the estate every morning, but she no longer spoke of it when she came home. She simply did her work and returned to the quiet of their home as if everything were normal. But Laura could see the fear in her mother's eyes. The way she flinched whenever someone knocked on the door or when a car drove by. It was clear that things had changed, and Laura knew, deep down, that something had to be done. But what? What could they do? Then, just when she thought she couldn't take the tension anymore, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was late one afternoon, when the knock on the door startled both of them. Laura opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Standing on the porch was a man in a dark suit, someone Laura had never seen before. He wasn't tall, but there was an air of authority about him that made Laura feel uneasy. "Good afternoon," the man said in a low voice. "Is Mrs. Rosa Martinez home?" Laura stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing as she stared at the man in the dark suit. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and an air of quiet authority that made her feel uneasy. His eyes, dark and calculating, seemed to take in everything about her in an instant. It was as though he was already assessing the situation, weighing the room, the house, and the woman inside. "Yes?" Laura asked, her voice shaky as she tried to hide the anxiety building in her chest. "I am looking for Mrs. Rosa Martinez," the man repeated, his tone polite but firm. "She's inside," Laura replied, a voice barely above a whisper. "But who are you? What do you want?" The man's gaze shifted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised by the question. "My name is Mr. Griffin," he said simply, his voice calm and measured. "I'm here on behalf of Colonel Smith." The mention of Colonel Smith made Laura's heart race. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just some random visitor. This was someone connected to the Colonel, someone sent with a purpose. But what was that purpose? What did they want from her mother now? Before she could ask anything further, Dona Rosa appeared behind her. She looked as if she had been expecting someone. Though she didn't say anything immediately, her face was pale, and her eyes flickered nervously as she looked at the man. "Mr. Griffin," Dona Rosa said softly, her voice betraying a hint of unease. "What brings you here?" "I am afraid I have some business with you, Mrs. Martinez," Mr. Griffin replied smoothly. "It's regarding your employment with the Colonel." Laura's mind raced. She could feel the tension in the room building, thick and suffocating. She had a bad feeling about this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. "Is there something wrong?" Dona Rosa asked cautiously, her voice tight. "Has something happened at the estate?" "Mr. Griffin glanced at Laura for a moment, then back at Dona Rosa. His expression remained unreadable. "Not exactly," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "But the Colonel is concerned. He feels that there are things that need to be discussed, things that can't be left unsaid." Laura's heart skipped a beat. The way he spoke, the way he phrased it, made her think that something was very wrong. Why was the Colonel sending this man? What did he want from her mother? "Things?" Laura repeated, her voice trembling as she tried to keep the fear from her words. "What do you mean, things?" Mr. Griffin gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. "This is an adult matter, miss. I am afraid you will have to excuse us." Laura stepped back instinctively, her instincts telling her to leave the room, to give them space. But something held her back. She had to know what was going on. She couldn't just let her mother face this man alone, not with the way things had been at the Colonel's estate. Dona Rosa gave Laura a brief, almost imperceptible nod,
signaling that she should stay.
"It's all right, Laura," she said softly.
"I'll be fine." But Laura wasn't convinced.
She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold.
Her mother hadn't seemed this shaken since the day she had accepted the job at the estate. There was more to this visit, more to Mr. Griffin's presence than he was letting on. As the man stepped further into the house, Dona Rosa led him to the small living room. She motioned for him to sit, and he did so without hesitation. Folding his hands neatly in his lap, Dona Rosa sat across from him, her face tense, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "I'm listening, Mr. Griffin," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that Laura could hear in it. "The Colonel has been very pleased with your work," Mr. Griffin began, his tone smooth and formal.
"But there's something that needs to be addressed, something important."
"We're afraid you may have misunderstood your role, Mrs. Martinez, or, perhaps more accurately, you've been led to believe that your position is more than what it truly is." Laura's heart raced as she stood just outside the living room.
Her ear pressed to the door.
She couldn't believe what she was hearing. What did he mean by that? Her mother had been doing her best to please the Colonel, had been working hard to earn a better life for them.
Was it all for nothing? Dona Rosa's voice was steady, though Laura could hear the edge in it.
"What are you implying, Mr. Griffin?" The man leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, as if he were about to deliver something crucial.
"You see, the Colonel has been testing you, Mrs. Martinez.
"Testing your loyalty."
And it appears you passed, to a degree. But there's still something that hasn't been resolved." Dona Rosa's face paled, her eyes wide with confusion.
"Testing me? What do you mean by that?"
Mr. Griffin's smile faded slightly, and he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Dona Rosa. "The Colonel isn't just looking for someone to work in his house. He's looking for someone he can trust, someone he can rely on. He wants to know who you really are, what you're truly capable of." Laura's mind was spinning.
She couldn't believe what she was hearing. What had the Colonel been doing to her mother? Why was he playing these games?
"I don't understand," Dona Rosa said softly, her voice trembling.
"I've worked for him. I've done everything he asked." Mr. Griffin's expression grew colder, more calculating. "Exactly.
"And now, it's time to take the next step.
The Colonel wants to see how far you're willing to go to prove your loyalty.
He wants to see if you're willing to do
whatever it takes." There was a long pause,
the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air. Laura felt like she couldn't breathe. She had heard enough.
She had to know the truth, but she couldn't keep listening from the hallway. She opened the door just enough to peek inside, her heart pounding in her chest. What was her mother going to do? How would she respond to this? What was the next step in this twisted game? The conversation inside the house grew heavier, the tension thickening with every word exchanged.
Laura stood frozen by the door, her body tense, her breath shallow as she listened to every syllable. The truth was becoming clearer by the second.
And the realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her mother had been drawn into something far more dangerous than she had ever realized.
The Colonel wasn't just a wealthy man offering a job. He was a man with power, with influence, and with a dark side that Laura had never imagined.
And now, it seemed that darkness was closing in on them. Dona Rosa's voice trembled as she spoke.
"I don't understand. I've been nothing but loyal to him."
"What do you want from me?"
Mr. Griffin's eyes narrowed, his gaze cold and calculating.
"Loyalty is not enough, Mrs. Martinez."
"The Colonel wants to know if you can be trusted with something much more valuable. He wants to know if you're willing to do things that will ensure his position, his safety, his success." Laura's heart raced as she leaned in closer, barely able to contain her anger.
She had always known that people like the Colonel played by their own rules, but she never imagined that her mother would be swept into it. She thought the job would give them a better life, not drag them into a world of manipulation and control. "What are you asking her to do?"
Laura couldn't help but blurt out, her voice trembling with both fear and fury.
The man turned slowly toward her, as if he had been expecting her to appear.
His expression softened into something almost sympathetic.
But it was the kind of sympathy that made Laura's skin crawl. "It's not for you to worry about, young lady."
"Your mother knows what she's dealing with." Dona Rosa's face tightened at the mention of Laura, but she didn't respond right away.
She was too busy processing what Mr. Griffin had just said.
"What does he want me to do, exactly?"
she asked, her voice steady, but with a sharp edge of defiance.
Mr. Griffin let out a small sigh, as though he were explaining something to a child.
"He wants to ensure his interests are protected, Mrs. Martinez, and if you want to keep your position, To keep your job and continue receiving his generosity, you will have to prove your commitment. The colonel has many enemies rivals who would do anything to see him fall, and he needs to know that you are more than just someone who works for him.
You must be someone he can trust with everything. Someone who will do whatever is necessary to secure his future. Laura clenched her fists in the hallway.
Her mind spinning. You asking her to betray herself, she said, her voice rising in anger. To betray everything we stand for. You asking her to sell her soul for a job. Mr. Griffin's expression hardened, his patience wearing thin. This is not about morals, young lady. It's about survival.
The colonel does what he must to stay in power.
And now, your mother must prove that she is willing to be a part of that survival. If she's not, well, things could get very difficult for you both. Laura's heart sank.
The implications of what Mr. Griffin was saying were chilling.
This wasn't just about a job. It was about control, manipulation, and power, things Laura had always believed were reserved for people like the colonel, people with wealth and influence.
But now, it seemed her mother was caught in this web, and there was no way out without risking everything.
Is this what you want, Mama?
Laura asked, her voice breaking.
Is this the life you want for us?
To be stuck in his world, to be tied to him forever. You don't owe him anything.
Dona Rosa's face was unreadable as she sat in the living room, her hands shaking slightly. She looked down at her lap, her lips pressed together tightly.
Laura could see the internal struggle written all over her mother's face.
But she didn't know what to say. What could she say?
Mr. Griffin's voice interrupted the silence. The choice is yours, Mrs. Martinez.
You can accept the colonel's terms and continue to work in his estate.
Or you could walk away, but be warned. Walking away might cost you more than you're willing to pay. Dona Rosa looked up slowly, meeting Laura's gaze for a brief moment before turning back to the man. Her decision was weighing heavily on her. Laura could see the tension in her mother's posture, the way she seemed to shrink inward, as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. The room was heavy with silence. Laura's mind raced.
What could they do? What choice did they have? The colonel had already proven that he wouldn't let them go easily. The question was no longer about loyalty. It was about survival.
If Dona Rosa turned away, would the colonel make good on his threats? Finally, Dona Rosa spoke, her voice low but clear.
I need time to think, she said quietly. Her eyes locked on Mr. Griffin's. I can't make any decisions right now. Mr. Griffin nodded, seemingly understanding. Of course.
Take all the time you need, Mrs. Martinez. But remember, the clock is ticking. The colonel is waiting for an answer. With that,
he stood up and walked toward the door. Dona Rosa remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she stared into space.
Laura felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She didn't know what the right choice was. All she knew was that her mother was trapped by promises, by fear, and by a world that didn't care about them.
As the door closed behind Mr. Griffin, Laura turned to face her mother. Mama, what are we going to do?
Dona Rosa didn't answer right away. She sat there, lost in thought, her eyes distant. For a moment, Laura thought her mother might say nothing at all. But then, slowly, Dona Rosa spoke. I don't know, Laura. I don't know what the right thing is anymore. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence.
The weight of Mr. Griffin's words lingered in the air like an unwanted cloud.
Laura couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through her fingers, that they were being pulled deeper into a world they didn't belong to.
Her mother's silence was the worst part. She had become a shadow of the woman Laura once knew, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the choices now before her. Each day felt longer than the last. Dona Rosa spent hours pacing the small house, her face furrowed with worry, her thoughts far away.
Laura had never seen her mother so lost, so defeated.
The house, once a place of warmth and hope, now felt cold and unwelcoming, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of the uncertainty that loomed over them.
Laura, too, was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to protect her mother, to tell her to walk away from the colonel, to refuse to play the dangerous game he had set before them. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple.
The colonel had power, and power meant consequences. The more Laura thought about it, the more she realized that even if her mother turned her back on the colonel, there was no guarantee they would be safe. Every time she tried to talk to her mother, to ask what she was thinking, Dona Rosa would only shake her head and say, I need more time. Laura hated the silence, hated how the questions piled up, each one more urgent than the last. But her mother wasn't ready to answer. It was as though the weight of the decision was too much for her to bear, and with each passing day, the pressure seemed to mount. Then, one morning, everything changed. It was early, the sun still low in the sky, when Dona Rosa finally spoke.
Laura was sitting at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold.
She hadn't expected her mother to speak today. She had learned to expect nothing, but when Dona Rosa's voice broke the stillness, Laura looked up in surprise. "I've made up my mind," Dona Rosa said, her voice steady, though there was a trace of fear in it.
I can't live like this anymore, Laura. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. Laura's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat.
"What do you mean? What have you decided?" Dona Rosa took a deep breath, her eyes distant as she spoke.
I've been thinking about what Mr. Griffin said, and I've been thinking about us.
"About our future, and I've realized something." Laura waited, holding her breath. "I'm not going to do it," her mother said, her voice firm now, like someone who had finally come to terms with the truth. "I'm not going to keep playing his game. I'm not going to betray myself, my values, or you, Laura." The words hit Laura like a wave, and for a moment, she couldn't speak.
Her mind raced, trying to process what her mother was saying.
You
You're going to leave?
You're going to quit?" Dona Rosa nodded slowly, a quiet resolve settling over her.
I have to. I've been thinking about it for days, and I know this is the right decision. The Colonel is a dangerous man, and if I stay with him, we'll never be free. I can't risk our lives anymore. Laura's heart swelled with relief, but she also felt a knot of fear. Her mother's words were bold, but they also carried a heavy weight.
Leaving the Colonel wasn't just about walking away from a job. It was about walking away from a life that had offered some semblance of security, even if it had come with strings attached.
I don't know what will happen when we leave, Dona Rosa continued, her eyes meeting Laura's. But I know one thing. I can't stay in this world anymore. I won't let it destroy us. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Laura felt a surge of admiration for her mother, but also fear for what the future held.
They had no backup plan, no safety net.
It was just the two of them, facing an uncertain future. But at that moment, Laura knew one thing for certain. Her mother had made the right choice.
They would fight. They would survive.
And they would rebuild their lives together, away from the Colonel's grasp.
Later that day, when Mr. Griffin came to the door, his usual smug expression already in place, Dona Rosa stood tall, her face resolute.
I'm not interested in continuing this arrangement, she said, her voice steady and firm.
I'm leaving. Mr. Griffin's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening.
You don't understand the consequences of your actions, Mrs. Martinez, he said, his voice low and dangerous.
The Colonel doesn't like being rejected. I don't care, Dona Rosa replied.
I've made my decision. If the Colonel wants to make an enemy of me, then so be it. There was a long, tense silence. Mr. Griffin stared at her for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, without another word, he turned and left the house, his footsteps heavy as he walked down the path.
Dona Rosa didn't flinch.
She didn't back down. She had made her choice, and she would live with it,
no matter what came next. As the door closed behind him, Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. We did the right thing, she said softly, though her heart still raced with the uncertainty of what the future held. Dona Rosa looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. I hope so, Laura. I really do. And with that, they began the long road to freedom, unsure of where it would lead, but certain that they had chosen the path that would give them the chance to live their own lives, free from the control and manipulation of the Colonel. Days turned into weeks after that decision, and with each passing day, the weight of their choice seemed to grow heavier.
Laura and her mother, now free from the clutches of the Colonel, found themselves facing a reality they hadn't anticipated. They were alone.
Dona Rosa had left the job, and though she was resolute in her decision,
the consequences were beginning to show themselves.
The small savings they had were quickly running out, and the bills that had once seemed so manageable now felt overwhelming. They had no safety net, no backup plan, and nowhere to turn for help.
The world outside the security of the Colonel's power seemed colder and more unforgiving than they had imagined.
But through it all, Dona Rosa remained determined.
She found odd jobs here and there, doing whatever she could to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Laura, too, helped where she could, picking up whatever work she could find, babysitting for neighbors, running errands, anything that would allow them to scrape by.
It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally.
There were nights when Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they had made a mistake.
Maybe they should have stayed. Maybe they could have found a way to make things work with the Colonel, just to avoid the crushing uncertainty that had taken over their lives. But in the quiet moments, when she thought of everything her mother had endured to get them to this point, she knew they couldn't go back. There was no going back to that world, no matter how tempting it seemed. One chilly evening, after a long day of work, Dona Rosa came home looking more worn out than usual.
Her face was drawn, her eyes tired. Laura had just finished dinner, a meager meal of rice and beans, when she noticed her mother's strange demeanor. She hadn't said anything yet, but there was something in the air, something that told Laura this wasn't just exhaustion.
"What's wrong, Mama?"
Laura asked, her voice laced with concern. She pushed aside her own tiredness and walked over to her mother, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coat.
Dona Rosa sat down heavily in the chair, rubbing her forehead as if trying to erase the fatigue from her body.
"I ran into someone today," she said quietly. "Someone from the Colonel's circle." Laura's stomach tightened. She had hoped that once they left, they would be left in peace, that the past would remain behind them. But deep down, she had always known it wasn't that simple.
People like the Colonel didn't just let go of their property, especially not someone like Dona Rosa.
Someone who had been so useful to him.
Who was it?
Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man named Lewis," Dona Rosa replied, her voice tight. "He works for the Colonel. He told me that if I ever wanted to come back, if I ever wanted to make things right, the offer would still stand." Laura's heart skipped a beat. The Colonel hadn't given up. He was trying to lure her mother back, to make her feel like there was still something to gain by returning to his side. But the thought of returning to that life made Laura's skin crawl. The power, the control, the manipulation, it was all still there, waiting for them.
"What did you say?"
Laura asked, afraid of the answer.
Dona Rosa looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a sadness Laura had never seen before.
"I told him no, I told him I wasn't going back. But he warned me, Laura. He said that leaving the Colonel's side would have consequences.
That it wasn't just about walking away.
He said the Colonel never forgets those who betray him." Laura swallowed hard, trying to process the weight of her mother's words. It was one thing to leave, to walk away from the Colonel's world.
But it was another thing entirely to be marked by someone like him. There was no escaping his reach, no matter how far they ran.
"What kind of consequences?" Laura asked, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Dona Rosa said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "But Lewis made it clear that the Colonel has many ways of making people regret their decisions for the first time since they had made the decision to leave." Laura felt a pang of fear deep in her chest.
She had known that there would be challenges, but she hadn't known that it would follow them like this. They had hoped to build a new life, but now the spectre of the Colonel's wrath loomed over them. The evening passed in a heavy silence.
Dona Rosa tried to reassure her daughter, telling her that they would be okay, that they had made the right choice.
But Laura could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the way she tried to hide it behind a mask of optimism.
She knew that things weren't going to be easy, and the path ahead would be even harder than they imagined.
As the days went on,
strange things began happening.
Small, unsettling things.
There were whispers in the streets. People who seemed to know more about them than they should. Their neighbors began to avoid them, their once friendly smiles replaced by cold, distant looks. Laura could sense the change, the way people's attitudes shifted as if they were being watched. As if someone was sending a message. One afternoon, as Laura walked home from an errand, she saw a man standing outside their house.
He was leaning against the wall, watching the door intently, his face partially obscured by a hat. Something about him felt wrong, like a shadow in the daylight.
As soon as he noticed her, he straightened up and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate. Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she hurried inside.
"Mama," she called, her voice frantic.
"Someone's watching us." Dona Rosa looked up from the kitchen, her face pale.
"What do you mean? A man?"
He was just standing there,
watching the house. It was like he was waiting for something. Dona Rosa's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing in thought.
She didn't say anything at first, but Laura could see the wheels turning in her mother's mind. They had known that walking away from the Colonel wouldn't be without repercussions. But this felt different. This felt personal. The days that followed were filled with a sense of heightened vigilance. Laura and her mother could no longer afford to go about their lives as they once had.
The shadow of fear that had hung over them since Dona Rosa's meeting with Lewis was now more than just a passing worry. It was a presence that loomed over them, manifesting in strange encounters, unsettling gestures from neighbors, and whispers that followed them wherever they went.
Laura's heart raced every time she left the house, every time she turned a corner or passed a stranger on the street. It was as though they were being hunted,
Tracked by an invisible force that had no intention of letting them go.
It was a Friday afternoon when it happened. Laura had just returned from a small grocery store, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows along the street. As she neared their house, she noticed a car parked across the street.
Its engine running.
The windows were tinted, but she could just make out the silhouette of a man sitting inside, his face hidden in the shadows. Her stomach twisted. She had seen that car before.
It was the same one that had followed her home the other day.
Without thinking, she quickened her pace, crossing the street to avoid the vehicle. Her breath quickened as she neared the front door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle.
She wanted to believe she was just being paranoid, that it was nothing, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Inside, her mother was sitting at the table,
her hands folded in front of her, her face drawn and weary.
Dona Rosa didn't even look up when Laura entered, as if she were lost in thought, her mind miles away. "Did you see him?"
Laura asked breathlessly, trying to keep her voice steady.
Dona Rosa's eyes flickered up, and for a brief moment,
Laura saw a flicker of the fear that had begun to take root in her mother's heart.
"Who?" "The man in the car. The one who's been following us."
I saw him again. Dona Rosa stood up slowly, her face tight.
"It's getting worse, isn't it?" she asked quietly.
Laura nodded. I don't know what to do.
"Mama."
I feel like they're closing in on us. I don't feel safe here anymore. Dona Rosa was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing in thought. Then, as if coming to a decision, she walked over to the window and peeked through the curtain.
"We need to leave," she said quietly, her voice low but determined. "We can't stay here anymore."
It's too dangerous. Laura's heart sank.
The fear that had been building inside her now felt like a tangible weight, pressing down on her chest.
They couldn't keep running, could they? How much longer could they outrun the consequences of their actions?
"But where will we go?" Laura asked, the question more of a plea than a request for an answer. Dona Rosa turned away from the window, her face etched with determination.
I don't know, but we can't stay here. Not like this. Laura nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She knew her mother was right, but the uncertainty of their future felt overwhelming. She wanted to believe they could make a fresh start, but the reality of it was harder to swallow.
"We'll figure it out," Dona Rosa said softly, her voice filled with an unspoken promise. "We always do." That night, they packed what little they had left, some clothes, a few keepsakes, and enough money to get them by.
Dona Rosa had made a few phone calls, arranging for them to stay with a friend who lived several towns away.
It was risky, but it was the only option they had. As they slipped out of the house, moving quietly through the darkened streets, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the unknown. The future was a fog, and they were stumbling blindly through it, hoping that somehow they would find a way to survive. The drive to their new destination was long and tense, filled with long silences as both mother and daughter tried to make sense of what they were leaving behind. The weight of their decisions pressed down on them, but neither of them spoke about it. The night seemed endless, the road stretching out in front of them like a path they couldn't see the end of. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness, they arrived at their destination.
It was a small town, far removed from the shadows of their past.
The houses were modest but well kept, the streets quiet and peaceful.
It was a world away from the danger they had left behind. But even as they settled into the small house provided by Dona Rosa's friend, the feeling of uncertainty never quite left them.
They had escaped, for now, but they knew they couldn't let their guard down. The Colonel's reach was long, and no matter how far they ran, there was always the fear that he would find them again.
For the first time in a long while, Laura allowed herself to breathe, to rest. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. They had made it out.
They had chosen to walk away from the darkness, from the world that had tried to control them, and they were free. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.